Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be able finally be here in person, although the Hungarian Railways have done everything to sabotage me from arriving in time. Dear professors, dear conference participants, I'll try to be short, be in time. So we are living in an era in which new layers of the rule of law are emerging, gaining significance, and others are receding into the background. On the other hand, we see that the concept of the rule of law, which was a point of certainty for the European states with regard to the limits of exercise of power, is becoming uncertain and blurred. One answer we can therefore give to the question, what have the rule of law debates given us, is a sense of uncertainty. Critics of the European Union's rule of law mechanisms and the political debates surrounding them generally point out that the concept of the rule of law has become a tool for exerting political pressure, acquiring elements that were not previously part of it, not even using it equally, and that it is not clear which elements will appear as if by magic among these requirements. On the other hand, those who support these processes argue that all of the requirements are logical, common sense, predictable in the light of realities, and serve the public good. The concept of the rule of law is indeed undergoing a period of transformation. It is no longer possible to prevent, according to my opinion, change or return to the roots. Conceptual changes happen from time to time in the history. It is a normal process. The emergence of the substantive form of the rule of law is one of the prime examples for this. So what we may be possible is to find a balance between changes replacing uncertainty with certainty. What we can see is that the requirements of the rule of law, its content and enforcement, have in fact become a question of power. It is no longer exclusively a struggle for justice by the oppressed, but also a means of exercising power by those with the strongest power. And it is within this framework that the balance must be struck. If we think about it, the post-Soviet region received the rule of law with precisely this content after the transition in the form of the Copenhagen criteria and then later the FAR program. In terms of functions, therefore, there has been no major change. Focusing now on the content, with the emergence of the concept of the substantive rule of law in the process, the rule of law has been increasingly imbued with moral expectations, with the aim of ensuring that the exercise of power, including legislation and the application of the law, is not determined by law alone, but by an internal set of criteria. This conception of the rule of law accepts that the state acts only in a legal form. However, since this alone does not protect against laws that are themselves repressive, the rule of law doctrine seeks an additional principle. There are several attempts to find a solution to this additional protective function. Some envisage elaborate legislative procedures based on balance of power capable of preventing the adoption of tyrannical laws by a simple interplay of conflicting interests. Others rely on democracy to work. The most widespread idea sees the solution in subordinating the law to higher principles. One form of this is that of super-regulatory principles, which are those enshrined in the Constitution by the original framers. A further view is that super-legislative principles are not simply principles of positive law, but that they go beyond that and do not derive their value from legal documents. Such principles would be binding on the state, even if they were not written down, while at the same time giving the judge greater leeway. The essence of the substantive rule of law and what makes it more than its predecessors is that it not only incorporates the criteria of the formal rule of law, but complements them with a moral system centered on justice. The substantive rule of law does not merely refer to the law, but distinguishes between good laws and bad laws. The balance is the court itself that should be deciding legal questions according to the best theory of justice. The ideal law thus captures and enforces moral rights. The focus on this just law thus implies a very deep concept of law and the functioning of the state. The expectation that law should be just and protect the fundamental human rights of all members of the society distinguish a government under the rule of law from a government operating with a rule by law. Justice is in principle a general justice, which presupposes this general agreement on the essence of substantive justice. However, practice has not shown this to be the case, which is why international law and international human rights documents have emerged as a benchmark, because these documents include principles which the nations of the world have agreed upon as fundamental human rights of all human beings. In conclusion, the main value of the rule of law as a result of this development is that the state adopts laws which are just laws for society and exercises power in accordance with this principle. The law applies to everyone equally. Everyone knows what they have the right to and what they do not have, what consequences they have to face, to know that they are not at the mercy of the institutions and that it is mostly the institutions that exist for them and not they are the ones who exist for the institutions. And if their rights and freedoms are taken away, they have institutions to protect them from unlawful interference by the state. The rule of law thus brought with a completely different conception of the state and how the state works and functions. The substantive conception of the rule of law brought with it a development which resulted in the concept of the rule of law becoming more and more expansive, as it sought to respond to both existing powers and those that have not yet emerged with an ever more varied toolbox. This process intensified in the 1990s following the change of regime for many states. This period witnessed a kind of revival of the rule of law in which the concept was increasingly being used as a global solution to the problems and which led to a demand for its development. The background to these reform efforts was a problem that the states were struggling with poorly performing institutions, citizens' low regard for governments, and the challenges of going beyond mere democratic processes to genuinely democratic values and principles. Fortifying the weak rule of law appears to be a way of reaching a better performance of government institutions, politicians following law, and lessening human rights violations that has characterized many new democracies. These ideas have been complemented by the desire to see the rule of law reforms in so-called developing state as essential to stability and the establishment of norms that encourage investment and sustainable economic growth. Returning to the original question, we can say that debates on the rule of law have brought moral requirements to the fore and at the same time embraces certain economic expectations. As such, there has been no fundamental change in the rule of law, either in terms of function or in terms of its main elements. What has really changed is the strength and depth of intervention brought about by the European Union's rule of law mechanisms and the institutional framework associated with them. In the EU legal order, the conditionality regulation is the first EU legislative act to contain a definition of the rule of law. The underlying idea behind this in conditionality is a utilitarian rationality and links the granting of certain benefits, especially financial aid, with the implementation of specific policies and reforms or the fulfillment of concrete conditions. Taking into account the outcome, we can differ between positive conditionality and negative or punitive conditionality. Based on the point in time in which the respective conditionality is applied, ex ante and ex post conditionality both can exist. Thus, a conditionality mechanism is a tool for political and/or economic adjustments. With this conditionality, domestic policy, normative and constitutional decisions and fundamental political values, which are constitutive for membership in the EU, become conditions for the disbursement of European fundings. The seemingly most powerful tool in the hands of the European Union is the Article 7 procedure, which introduced a mechanism to determine whether a member state has committed a serious and persistent breach of fundamental European values in order to respond to a clear risk of a serious breach of EU values. In 2020, the annually rule of law report mechanisms was also introduced similarly as a preventive tool and to foster dialogue. It methodologically focuses on significant developments regarding to the legal and institutional framework relevant in 4 pillars: the justice system, anti-corruption framework, media pluralism, and institutional issues linked to checks and balances. Similarly to the conditionality mechanisms, it also connects to the basic requirement of the rule of law with anti-corruption. These instruments clearly demonstrate that the previously existing elements of the rule of law have not only become normative, but also shape its content and in certain cases are enforced by institutions with political power. The answer to the question of what the mechanisms of the rule of law have given us is therefore the set of expectations formulated and ultimately enforced by a system of institutions operating at a quasi-federal level. In this process, the next step which we have experienced is the expectations are surprisingly being detailed in the reform processes launched in the relation to the topics covered by the annual rule of law reports. Consultations are taking place not only on principles and objectives, but also on specific measures and their detailed rules. One of the main areas where this is happening is the justice system, where the rule of law criteria have traditionally focused on functions of legal remedies and the fairness of proceedings, fair trial. The essence of these expectations was to promote the rights of the parties and to ensure that legal disputes were resolved fairly. In contrast, the focus now has shifted to the functioning of the justice system, the appointment of judges, and organizational and administrative issues with legal disputes and the rights and interests of the parties being pushed in the background. These issues clearly demonstrate the importance of striving for balance, not only because of the rights of the parties involved, but also because there is considerable regulatory diversity among EU member states in these areas, which could have adverse effect in some cases. The same can be said of those efforts that claim to aim at restoring the rule of law with demands for the reversal of previous changes. The pendulum effect must be avoided, as the end does not justify the means. Corrective mechanisms are only in line with the actual expectations of the rule of law if they strike a balance between democracy, functionality, and legal certainty, and rights and constitutionally protected interest of those affected. Thank you very much for your attention.